in the music business, tomorrow, 9:40 on BBC Two.
A dramatic turn of events now on BBC Two. The past week's crucial proceedings in the controversial trial of O.J. Simpson.
The Simpson jury has been told that only one person in 170 million has DNA matching that found in the bloodstains at the crime scene. And one person with that exact pattern is O.J. Simpson. In a week that could prove to be the turning point in the trial, the long-awaited DNA evidence, a mountain of scientific information, was presented to the jury. In the past, DNA evidence has been used to devastating effect in murder trials, and its importance in this case cannot be overestimated. For the first part of this crucial week, O.J. Simpson's mother made a rare appearance, sitting behind her son in the packed courtroom. The prosecution witness, Dr. Robin Cotton, began her testimony on Monday. She's the director of a private forensic laboratory and in charge of much of the DNA testing for this case. A new face on the prosecution team, Woody Clark, is one of California's legal experts in DNA. First, he asked Dr. Cotton to explain DNA to the jurors.
DNA is that part of the chromosomes that carries the information that programs an organism from the point of conception, that is, from the point when an egg and a sperm come together. The DNA in the egg and the DNA in the sperm now makes up the total DNA for that organism. And the information in that DNA programs the development of that organism all the way through childhood, if it was a human, adulthood, and on through aging until that human being isn't alive anymore.
What is DNA itself? How would you describe it?
DNA is correctly described as a polymer. That is, it's a long series of components that are all attached together. And it's basically our cellular alphabet.
What role does DNA have in creating our bodies?
All of the information that predicts our structure, our height, our build, our skin color, our organs. You have a liver. That information on how that liver is going to be formed as the organism developed is contained in the DNA. And the DNA does that by containing the information that's eventually translated into proteins, and those proteins do the major part of the work in the cell. And so basically the DNA contains all information to make a specific organism.
Sometimes the term genetic blueprint has been attached to DNA.
And it's a good description.
Where is DNA actually found in our bodies?
It's found in the nucleus of each cell.
Is this entire molecule the same in every cell of our bodies?
Yes.
Can you describe, please, what are the various sources of DNA? In other words, various parts of the body that DNA can be taken from?
Well, DNA can be taken from almost any source. You can get DNA from bone, from any tissue, liver, spleen, pancreas, kidney, brain, skin, if you have enough, blood, semen, hair roots.
Dr. Cotton went on with her crash course in DNA, explaining its importance in the process of human identification and criminal investigations.
All of that DNA information that creates those things that we have in common will be basically the same from one person to the next. There is then a small portion of the DNA that is different from person to person. And that's intuitively obvious because you can look around even in a very large room or many people, and you'll see that with the exception of identical twins, people are different, even closely related people. Two brothers are different. You can always tell them apart.
With regard to, then, these portions of DNA where we differ, and I believe you said that's something less than 1% where we differ from one another?
That's right.
Why is that of interest? Why do you as a scientist care about that region or those regions where we're different?
In order to distinguish people, especially at the DNA level, you want to be looking at those sections of the DNA that are different from one person to the next. So you have to single out those sections, and for purposes of identifying or telling apart individuals, then you want to look at those sections of the DNA that are not the same from one person to the next.
The day finished early because of the funeral of a well-known LA detective unconnected to the case. Some in court wanted to attend. The first time DNA was ever used in a criminal case was in England in 1986. It was used in American courts a year later. Since then, DNA testing has been used throughout the US in thousands of murder, rape, and paternity cases. Last year, a convicted serial killer became the first person to be executed as a result of DNA evidence. And in the recent World Trade Center bombing case, a defendant was implicated by saliva he'd left on the flap of an envelope. DNA evidence is regularly used in courtrooms in nearly every state in the US, and it has been readily accepted by juries. In fact, only a few times since DNA was first used in American courts have juries gone against the DNA evidence. Recently, however, some scientists have become more vocal in their criticisms of DNA, and increasingly defense lawyers are challenging DNA evidence in the courtroom. The legal community will be watching the defense lawyers closely in this case as they try to undermine the DNA evidence against O.J. Simpson. When Dr. Robin Cotton returned to the stand on Tuesday, the jurors' science lesson continued. In anticipation of a defense attack on the methods of DNA testing, prosecution lawyer Woody Clark asked Dr. Cotton to explain the differences between the two kinds of tests known as RFLP and PCR. Of the two tests, RFLP is more accurate but requires a larger blood sample.
The RFLP test has the big advantage in that it's very discriminating from one person to the next. There's so much variation in the population that each time you look at another genetic locus or genetic location with RFLP, you're getting a lot of information. That is, you can discriminate one person from the next with a high level of discrimination. On the other hand, the PCR, the tests that are currently available, doesn't have that level of discrimination. It is a much lower level of discrimination, sort of in the range or maybe somewhat better than a whole series of serological markers. However, the PCR can use DNA when you have a very small amount, or it's in very poor condition, or both.
So in other words,
many of the blood samples underwent the PCR test. It is less reliable, and the defense is expected to concentrate heavily on the validity of these results. Clark then asked whether blood degraded by heat and humidity could give a false DNA result.
Can evidence at, for instance, crime scenes be subjected to basically the environment and the elements in that environment?
I don't think it's a question of can. I think it's a question of that's absolutely bound to happen.
Okay, what types of things can happen, for instance, to a piece of evidence found outdoors?
Well, it's going to be exposed to whatever temperatures are outdoors, whatever lighting conditions. There may be a lot of sunlight on that day. Could get rained or snowed on. I mean, if it's outside, it's going to be exposed to whatever's going on outside from the time that it was left there until the time that it's picked up.
Incidentally, would the same be true, for instance, of a soldier killed in battle out in a battlefield?
I would presume so.
Or dead animals?
Yeah, on dead animals too.
You've described a little bit about, for instance, heat. Would that represent one instance of an environmental effect or something that's possible that happens outside?
Sure.
And would that include sunlight as well?
Yes.
And I think you mentioned rain? Or
Well, I
perhaps
mean,
thought-
you said outside, so I was,
Okay.
well, it could get rain. I mean, in California, maybe not, but
Sometimes, some seasons it does.
You'd be surprised.
How about humidity? Is that something else that happens?
of course.
Are there other types of influences that are out there outside?
Oh, I think you've named the major ones.
With respect to these influences or effects like heat, humidity, rain, and so forth, what do they do to DNA? What's their effect on DNA?
Basically, all of those things over time will act to gradually degrade the DNA, that is, break it up. The generalization that most everybody is aware of is that dry and cold works to preserve DNA, and warm and moist works more towards degrading DNA. That's just a generalization, but that's pretty much the case.
We'll talk about storage of samples in just a few moments, but is there anything about these environmental effects, whether sunlight, humidity, rain, etc., that can actually change DNA from one type to another?
No.
How do you know that?
Well, you know that at a very basic level, because these things will not change the DNA sequence. Light, heat, all of these things will not result in changing the DNA sequence. Look at several
The prosecution was building up to the moment everyone had been waiting for all day. They were about to reveal to the jury X-rays showing the results of DNA testing of bloodstains found at the crime scene and at O.J. Simpson's house. But just at that point, Woody Clark ran out of time. At last, the prosecution was ready to ask Dr. Cotton to reveal the results of the DNA tests. Using DNA X-rays known as autoradiographs, or autorads, Clark asked Dr. Cotton to point out O.J. Simpson's DNA bands and compare them with the DNA bands found in various bloodstains. These were stains found beside the bodies at the Bundy crime scene, on the sole of Ronald Goldman's boot, and from the foyer of Simpson's home.
Now, from looking at these particular samples, and let me focus your attention on what appear to be the three evidence items. Number 52, the Bundy walkway. Number 78, Mr. Goldman's boot. And number 12, the Rockingham foyer. What can you tell us about the relative amounts of DNA in those three items from this X-ray?
From this film, number 12 would have the most in comparison to those three. Number 78 would have the sort of a middle amount, and number 52 would have the smallest amount of DNA.
So from left to right on those three items, basically the DNA goes up in terms of its amount?
Yes.
Okay, what can you tell us about any conclusions or opinions you reached from this particular film?
From this particular film, you can, let's look at each piece of evidence individually. Item 52 has three bands close to the top, another grouping of three bands, and a single band down here, and that pattern is consistent and looks to be the same as the pattern from Mr. Simpson, which also has a group of three, another group of three, and a single band down at the bottom. And because, sorry.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Because it's also has the same pattern, let's go on to sample 12. It also has a group of three bands, another group of three bands, and a single band way down at the bottom. So the DNA banding pattern from item 52 and item 12 are I'm now speaking as if I was making an initial interpretation from this film, they're certainly consistent with the pattern from Mr. Simpson. Later on, after doing some measurements, you would make a determination that where you would say the patterns match or they do not match. But at this point, they're visibly the same.
Could you place the arrows on each of the bands you see in the Bundy walkway lane, item number 52?
I'll just, so we don't have too many arrows up here, I'll just point to the middle band in this group of 3 and the middle band in this group of 3, just indicating that I have a group of 3 and a single band down here at the bottom. I'll make the same designation for the 2 groups of 3 bands in item number 12 and the single band down towards the bottom, and the group of 3 from the known sample from Mr. Simpson, the second group of 3, and the single band down at the bottom.
Dr. Cotton, with regard to, and let's start with item number 52, the Bundy stain, is Mr. Simpson included or excluded as a donor of the DNA in that sample following your review of all of the x-rays regarding that particular sample?
I would object as to the Bundy stain, and I would ask for just an instruction from the court.
You've made the objection. It's noted. Proceed.
Mr. Simpson is included as a possible donor to that item.
How do you base that opinion? Is there a short way you can describe that from what you've just reviewed with the jury?
When you review the DNA bands from, we're on 52, right?
Yes.
Yes.
The Bundy stain.
When you review, excuse me, when you review the DNA bands that are visible in the cocktail and in each individual film for that item, in each case they are consistent with the bands that are seen in Mr. Simpson's pattern.
And at how many different genetic markers is that the case?
Altogether, there are 5 genetic markers.
With respect to those 5 markers, is there a term you use when an individual cannot be excluded as a donor at a particular genetic marker using this RFLP process?
The term that you may be referring to is match, and that term implies that not only are the bands visually similar, but when analyzed on the computer imaging system and a DNA fragment size is calculated, that those sizes are also close enough together to confirm your visual interpretation that the patterns are very similar. So, in fact, when you go through that exercise, the bands in item 52 match the bands in Mr. Simpson.
As far as looking at these patterns from these various films with your eye, did Mr. Simpson match item number 52, the Bundy stain?
Yes.
As far as this imaging process or the use of the computer that you described, did he match at these 5 genetic marker locations the DNA found in the Bundy stain?
Yes.
Now, turning your attention to the Foyer stain from the Rockingham Foyer, item number 12. Following your review of the material that you've just described in court, what statement, if any, can you make about Mr. Simpson and that particular stain?
The DNA banding pattern from item number 12 in the Foyer matches the DNA banding pattern from Mr. Simpson.
With respect to this computer, this imaging device, what conclusions were reached with regard to that stain in Mr. Simpson?
Well, actually what I just said was a compilation of both the visual assessment and the computer imaging data, and the 2 patterns do match.
As far as the possibility that Ronald Goldman or Nicole Brown contributed either of those stains, what can you say?
They definitely did not.
If the blood stain on the sole of Ronald Goldman's boot belonged to Nicole Brown Simpson, it supported the prosecution's theory that she had been attacked first and was therefore the killer's main target.
Are there any banding patterns on this X-ray film with regard to the boot stain?
Yes.
And could you use the arrows again and describe their location?
There are two bands close together, and I'm marking them with the arrows.
With regard to the individuals, that is, the three individuals, the known samples, can you make any statement, first of all, about Mr. Simpson as being a possible donor of the DNA on the boot stain?
He is excluded.
What about Nicole Brown?
She is included. She has two bands also in a similar position to the ones in the boot stain.
And could you use the arrows again to note their location, that is, in her sample? And then lastly, what about Mr. Goldman?
There are no additional bands with this probe from the boot stain, so there's no information. That is, he doesn't seem to be there based on this probe alone, and based on the compilation of the data, it doesn't add anything to what we've already seen.
So with respect to Mr. Goldman, after having reviewed the cocktail X-ray as well as the 5 individual genetic marker locations, what statement can you ultimately make about Mr. Goldman and the stain material from the boot?
Based on all of the information together, he cannot be definitively excluded, but he cannot be definitively included either. So the results regarding Mr. Goldman and item 78 are inconclusive.
What about Nicole Brown and the DNA found in that stain from the boot?
Based on all of the films, she is included based on the computer imaging data. The bands that are consistent with Nicole Brown in item 78 do match the bands in the known sample from Nicole Brown.
Finally, Clark asked Dr. Cotton about DNA results from the testing of a pair of socks found in O.J. Simpson's bedroom the day after the killings.
Now, you have indicated with 8 arrows what appear to be 8 bands, is that correct?
That's right.
It looks like there is 1 band and then a little lower 2 bands fairly close together,
Yes,
and then another band below that,
and that would be this one.
and 1 below that,
Yes,
and then what appear to be 3 bands fairly close together.
yes.
Now, can you examine the banding patterns from Nicole Brown, Ron Goldman, as well as Mr. Simpson? And first of all, can you tell us if any individuals on this particular film are excluded as possible donors of that DNA?
Mr. Simpson's known sample is in this lane, and he is excluded. The bands in the sock do not line up with the bands in Mr. Simpson's pattern. There's also one down here.
So Mr. Simpson could not have donated that DNA that was found on the sock.
That's right.
All right, what about the remaining 2 individuals?
Mr. Goldman could not have donated the DNA on the sock. That pattern is clearly different than the pattern on the sock.
So he would be excluded as a donor of the blood stains found on that sock?
That's right. He would be excluded.
What about Nicole Brown?
Nicole Brown is not excluded. She has 8 bands, and they are consistent and in similar positions to the DNA bands that are found on the sock.
And could you use the arrow again to show us the location of her bands on this particular film? As a result of your interpretation of this initial autorad, this film, this cocktail film, what conclusions, if any, could you reach?
The conclusions that you can reach from this film are that Mr. Simpson and Mr. Goldman could not have been the donor of the DNA found on the sock, and Nicole Brown could be the donor of the DNA found on the sock.
From Dr. Cotton's dry and technical testimony had come the most damning evidence so far against O.J. Simpson.
The material that you received in the lab.
While defense lawyers in court considered how they might regain the initiative, the tabloid show Inside Edition revealed OJ supporters are beginning to waver.
The picture that it paints is not definitely good. It's you know, I think it's getting a little tighter around his neck. But
Greg Johnson has every reason to believe in O.J. Simpson's innocence. The two ex-football players have been friends since they worked together on the TV series First and 10.
It really does shock me to think that the evidence is as strong now as it is.
And on the nightly discussion program Rivera Live, Nicole Brown Simpson's sisters talked about O.J. and Nicole's two young children.
All of a sudden she says to me, she goes, "Denise, you lied to me." I said, "Sweetheart, I didn't lie to you." And she says, "You told me my daddy was with the police." And I said, "He is with the police in jail." And she goes, "Oh, okay." And the saddest part of the whole thing is that I was tucking her into bed, and she says, "Denise," she goes, "people that kill people, don't they get put on the electric chair?" And I said, I was so happy that I was able to tell her, no. He's not going to be put on the electric chair. You can rest assured of that.
On the entertainment shows, the focus was a new book about Johnny Cochran.
And in the all-important category of books, 8 so far, here comes number 9. Life after Johnny Cochran won't be a wimpy love story. Barbara Cochran Berry, the ex-wife of Dream Teamer Johnny, calls her former spouse, quote, the ex-husband from hell. No one is saying just how juicy this book is going to be, but judging from this interview on Geraldo, life after Johnny Cochran is bitter.
Manipulative or controlling or power hungry or self-absorbed, self-centered, all those words I would use to describe him.
Neufeld, Mr. Simpson, do you want to
On Thursday morning, the prosecution set up a large light box to display all the auto rads at the same time. Due to the positioning of the box, O.J. Simpson, accompanied by his lawyers and the sheriff's deputies, was permitted to view it close up. In the absence of the jury, defendants are sometimes allowed to move around the courtroom. Shortly afterwards, Dr. Robin Cotton continued presenting both the RFLP and PCR results of the DNA testing.
Turning your attention now to number 52, which is labeled the Bundy Walkway. First of all, you've already described RFLP results with respect to that Bundy stain. Is that right?
That's right.
And I believe you described that there was a match between Mr. Simpson and this stain at a number of genetic markers. Is that right?
That's correct.
Or probes, as you've used the term?
That's right.
How many probes did Mr. Simpson match the 52 Bundy stain at?
5.
Your Honor, with the court's permission, there is a column with RFLP results, and I'm going to ask to be able to reveal that at this time also.
Proceed.
In other words, Dr. Cotton, was there a 5-probe match between Mr. Simpson and number 52, the Bundy stain, using your RFLP technique?
Yes, there was.
Did you also test that sample using PCR?
Yes, we did.
With what results?
The PCR results exclude Mr. Goldman and Nicole Brown, and they include Mr. Simpson.
All right, again, Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to reveal the remaining 2 magnetic covers.
Yes.
Then Woody Clark asked Dr. Cotton about the results of DNA testing of nail clippings taken from Nicole Brown Simpson.
With regard to number 84A, the left nail clippings and scrapings, did you test that particular item?
Yes, we did.
And did you subject that, or was it tested using PCR?
Yes, it was.
With what results?
We're now on 84A?
Yes.
Okay. The results from the PCR testing on 84A are consistent with Nicole Brown Simpson and exclude Ronald Goldman and Mr. Simpson.
All right, and that was at, again, 6 genetic markers?
That's right.
All right, Your Honor, with the court's permission as to that item, the left nail clippings and scrapings, I'm going to ask for permission to remove the covers.
Yes.
This was an important point for the prosecution. Last week, the defense had claimed that the blood under Nicole Brown Simpson's fingernails must have come from an unknown killer, as the blood type matched neither the victims nor O.J. Simpson. Now there was DNA evidence to refute that claim. The day before, the results of an RFLP test on the socks found in O.J. Simpson's bedroom had indicated a match with the DNA of Nicole Brown Simpson. Clark went on to ask Dr. Cotton about a PCR test carried out on the same socks.
Now, turning your attention, Dr. Cotton, if I can, to PCR testing, was that also done on this DNA, this bloodstain material from that sock?
Yes, it was.
With what results?
The results from the PCR testing, which is DQ alpha and polymarker, include Nicole Brown as being a donor and exclude Mr. Goldman and Mr. Simpson.
All right, Your Honor, at this time, may I remove the final cover?
You may.
Does that mean then, Dr. Cotton, that not only RFLP typing matched Nicole Brown, but so did 6 additional genetic markers using PCR?
It certainly does.
Now, Dr. Cotton, I'd like to...
Dr. Cotton then estimated the odds that the blood on the socks had come not from Nicole Brown Simpson, but from someone else.
For the RFLP results, the range of numbers goes from the most... Oh, wait 1 second. The most common being the approximation for Western Hispanics, and that is 1 in 6.8 billion. The mid-range figure is for Caucasians, and that number is approximately 1 in 9.7 billion. And the figure that would be most rare is for African Americans, and that number is 1 in 530 billion.
All right, Dr. Cotton, could you on the board, and referring to again the exhibit, People's Exhibit 262, write in that range for the 5-probe match between Nicole Brown and the sock? Next to what's been labeled RFLP under the frequency column.
Then Woody Clark turned to the blood stain found next to Nicole Brown Simpson's body at the Bundy crime scene. Clark asked Dr. Cotton about the chances of it belonging to someone other than O.J. Simpson.
The frequency that is calculated for African Americans and Caucasians is the same, and those estimations are that that set of characteristics would occur in approximately 1 in 170 million individuals. The frequency for Western Hispanics is more rare than that, and that frequency is that same set of RFLP characteristics would occur in approximately 1 in 1.2 billion.
1.2 billion?
Yes.
Now, as far as that estimate for African Americans and Caucasians, does that mean that these characteristics that Mr. Simpson has that are also found in the Bundy Walk bloodstain are only found in approximately 1 out of 170 million Caucasians or African Americans?
Yes, approximately.
With these staggering statistics, the prosecution ended their direct examination. Peter Neufeld began his cross-examination by asking a series of hypothetical questions based on the defense's theory that the samples had been subject to contamination in the evidence processing room.
I'm asking you to assume, for the purpose of this hypothetical, that the items, the swatches taken from the Bundy blood drops became so degraded as to lose all recognizable DNA. Okay?
Yes.
Thank you. And I'm asking you to assume that at a later point in time at the Los Angeles Police Department laboratory, they came into contact inadvertently with swatches from Rockingham that had Mr. Simpson's blood on it and that had more DNA in them. Okay?
Yes.
I'm asking you to assume that they also came into contact with Mr. Simpson's reference sample, meaning the vial of fresh blood. All right? Just assume those three premises.
Excuse me, Your Honor. Objection. Assumes facts not in evidence. Foundation.
Your Honor, the subject...
Sustained. As to that additional item, that's more than we discussed at sidebar. Sustained.
Fine. Limit the hypothetical then to the Bundy swatches coming into contact with the Rockingham swatches. All right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, given those assumptions, is it possible, scientifically, that when they come into contact with Rockingham swatches, that there can be cross-contamination from Rockingham swatches to the Bundy swatches? Is that scientifically possible?
Are you asking me if it's scientifically possible, or does the state of the DNA in this case support that?
I'm asking you whether it's scientifically possible, Dr. Cotton.
Certainly, I suppose it would be scientifically possible for a very small amount of material to be transferred from one swatch to another.
Peter Neufeld then wanted to know about the database used to calculate Dr. Cotton's statistics.
Now, I take it, Dr. Cotton, that to arrive at a frequency of 1 in 170 million people, you did not test the blood of 170 million people.
That's obviously correct.
In fact, you didn't test the blood of even 1 million people, is that right?
Not in my lifetime.
Or even 100,000 people?
We tested, as I said before, for the database, the size ranges from about 150 to about 325. If you add all the people in the database up, all three racial groups, it comes to around 500 to 600.
Fine, Dr. Cotton, so it's 200. What's the largest number? What's the largest number in the database for any of those 5 probes?
$240.
So what you did was you looked at the DNA profiles of 240 people, and from that you extrapolated a number for the frequency of Mr. Simpson's DNA profile of 1 in 170 million people. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, to compile this African American database, did you seek subjects from different countries in Africa?
No.
Did you seek subjects from different African American communities scattered across the United States?
No, we did not.
In fact, your entire database, your entire African American database comes from the Red Cross, comes from the Red Cross in Detroit, Michigan. Isn't that right?
Yes, it does.
But after Neufeld asked about the extent to which this type of data is accepted within the scientific community, Judge Ito became angry with the bickering lawyers.
Thank you.
Your Honor, that was rejected and never published.
Your Honor, it was rejected because it was unpublished.
Wait.
That was...
Both of you.
The jurors were quickly removed from the court.
Both counselors sanctioned $250. Get your checkbooks out. Right now. The answer to the court's question was the letter proposed in Science magazine. The other part was objection. The fact that it was never published was an argument. I'm not going to tolerate that kind of stuff anymore. We clear? March over to the clerk, both of you. And the attorneys may not bill their clients for this. This is a personal sanction. You're welcome.
Expenses aside, Thursday had been a very successful day for the prosecution, with Dr. Cotton proving to be an excellent witness during cross-examination. She was to return to the stand the following day. The trial of O.J. Simpson is causing an increasing number of Americans to lose respect for their criminal justice system. According to a survey by the American Bar Association, nearly half of all those questioned have become disillusioned as a result of the trial.
This is a prime example of how money can buy justice. Of course, we don't know the outcome of the trial so far, but just the fact that you have a guy who can afford 8 or 9 of the greatest legal minds in the world shows you something that, that if this had been a bus driver who was charged of double murder, he'd have one attorney, the case would be tried in about 2 or 3 weeks, and it would never be telecast on TV worldwide. So I think you definitely have, there's definitely a two-sided two-sided system here where he is getting better legal representation than maybe you or I could afford. Shapiro and Cochran both command about $750 an hour, and you're talking about where the average criminal attorney in the United States makes from about $175 to about $250 to $300 an hour, so that they basically make double the salary. And just think all these hours adding up, OJ's not going to have much money when it's all over.
Well, we have a defendant who has a great deal of money, or at least he had a great deal of money. I think he's expended most of it on his team of lawyers. And because when you have a lot of money, you just hire lawyers who hire sub-lawyers, who hire experts on DNA, who hire experts on particular fields. Most defendants are not in that position. Most defendants are going to have either court-appointed counsel or one lawyer, and that lawyer is going to have to do all the work. Even if he or she is not an expert in DNA, for example, the odds are he or she is going to have to become an expert on DNA. But O.J. Simpson has or had a great deal of money, and he has assembled what his lawyers believe is the best team.
It seems both sides in this case are going all out to win, regardless of cost. This week, the prosecution brought forward yet another lawyer to argue the state's case against O.J. Simpson. Although they have only half the number of lawyers used by the defense, it is still far above the average found in California murder trials.
It is quite unusual, and it's important for people to realize that this is very, 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 very atypical. Particularly in federal court proceedings, you're very seldom going to see more than 2 lawyers, no matter how complex the case. One of the things that you want to do as a trial lawyer is develop a rapport with the jury and some real credibility so that the jurors get to know you and trust you and believe you. That never happens if you've got that many lawyers.
The concept is that having more lawyers and subspecialists and experts should help the defendant. Will it? We don't know until we know what the verdict is. If one believes in this age of specialization that specialized experts are helpful, then presumably someone who has made a career for a number of years, for example, of knowing the ins and outs of DNA, should be superior to someone who has not. But to a certain extent, that's balanced out because we have the defense team of DNA experts, to use that as an example. Then we have the prosecution team. They don't agree. They're going to fight each other. We're going to get into a battle of the experts. Will the jury be any better off? No, it'll probably be more confused.
Whether these lawyers manage to make DNA understandable is still to be seen. But as the Bar Association poll shows, one idea the public does seem to have clear is that money can affect justice.
I think it probably accurately reflects a sense of great dissatisfaction and loss of respect for a process that, although it may have been less well known, was certainly thought more highly of than what we've seen in this case, an atypical case giving a bad name to the American justice system.
On Friday, Dr. Robin Cotton returned to the witness stand for her 5th day of testimony. Defense lawyer Peter Neufeld resumed his cross-examination by asking her about the collection and storage of blood samples. With the use of graphics, Neufeld asked her to illustrate how different factors might increase degradation of blood.
This is a blood swatch representing the blood stain on it coming from person 1. And on that blood swatch, I have placed the number 1 4 times to suggest a certain quantity, whatever it is, of DNA present in that swatch.
Okay.
Okay? And now Could you please show B? Now, would you agree, Dr. Cotton, that sealing that swatch in a plastic bag, if it is moist, if the swatch itself is still wet, can cause degradation of the DNA?
Over time, degradation will occur.
And that, okay. And putting it in a plastic bag, as opposed to a paper bag, for instance, enhances that degradation. Isn't that correct?
I don't think that, again, for the short term, it's going to make any difference. For a longer term, it would.
And when you say it would make a difference whether it's packaged in a plastic bag as opposed to, say, a brown paper bag?
Yes.
Okay. Would you please show the next one? And if you added to that plastic bag the factor of heat, the element of heat, would that even further enhance the degradation?
Probably would, yes.
Okay. Could you now add the next one? And again, just to reiterate, I think what you've already said, that as long as the blood swatch remains moist, that degradation will continue. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Could you do the next one, please?
Jack, at this point, is the foundation of relevance, assuming facts not in evidence.
And I think finally, the last element that you talked about before was the factor called time. And the longer the blood swatch is wet and remains in that plastic bag and is subjected to heat and moisture, the more it will degrade.
Yes, that's probably going to be the case.
Neufeld suggested that highly degraded blood that had been exposed to someone else's blood could give a misleading DNA result.
If you take that blood swatch, originally that came from person 1, and you brought it into actual contact with a wet blood swatch from person 2, or with fresh blood from person 2, could that cause cross-contamination as to the blood swatch that originally had the sample from person 1?
Objection. Improper hypothetical assumes facts not in evidence.
If the hypothetical is as you're suggesting, where you have a blood swatch and it no longer has typable DNA from person 1, and somehow it comes into contact with a second swatch that's wet in such a way that they are so closely connected as to transfer a sufficient amount of DNA to be typed, or a liquid blood sample, and same thing, you have to transfer a sufficient amount of DNA to be typed, then of course your hypothetical would be correct.
Neufeld was implying that the DNA evidence that placed O.J. Simpson at the crime scene could have been a result of cross-contamination. Dr. Cotton had remained unruffled by Neufeld's cross-examination, giving her answers with authority and confidence. She will return to the stand on Monday.
Even without knowing how...
The defense had suffered a discouraging week in the face of overwhelming DNA evidence, but they still managed to put on brave faces for the cameras.
But if you have degraded samples, as these obviously were, there's no question about that, and you have a terribly inferior and sloppy laboratory like LAPD packaging and processing them, it is not difficult for these kinds of things to happen. This was not a bad day for the defense.
Despite their display of confidence, the defense lawyers have a daunting challenge ahead. How they perform in the battle over DNA could decide the fate of O.J. Simpson.
They said this program could never be made.
The whips off. It doesn't